Please just bear with me 1 second. Just as a reminder also, today's session is recorded and we will make the recording available on the GoLab website within the next couple of days. So I was saying, I'm Andreea, I'm an associate at the GoLab. For those of you unfamiliar with the work of the GoLab, we're an academic center of research and practice, focusing on trying to understand and seek to improve the practice of outcomes-based commissioning, and within that, social impact bonds as well. And we do so by conducting academic research, looking at what works and what doesn't work, and the mechanisms by which outcomes-based approaches can help improve the provision of public services. But we're very much practice focused, so we spend a lot of time talking to government officials and sometimes providers as well who are interested in developing outcomes-based models. And often when we talk to commissioners developing social impact bonds, procurement keeps coming up as a major barrier. So today's session is very much about trying to demystify the whole process a little bit, and to also provide some, very practical, concrete advice around the existing options to help you ensure that the SIB development process remains focused on the goals of the project rather than becoming driven by a bureaucratic process. And I'm really delighted to be joined in today by two fantastic guests who between them have decades and decades of experience in this area. It is great to have you both here. Particularly as you bring in slightly different perspectives. So Joe, I know you work more closely with commissioners, so you'll be bringing in that commissioner perspective, whereas Julian has a particular expertise working with service providers. Undoubtedly they will endeavor to be neutral, but you might detect a slight bias in their perspective. So Jo is the former Deputy Director of the GoLab, and she's also the Director of Future Public. She has worked in and around public services in the UK and overseas for 30 years. And Jo, it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us today. Jo has been extensively involved in developing and delivering services paid for by resource in the welfare to work sector. And she has also been involved in the management and development of social impact bonds for children's services and for people with learning disabilities. If you just bear with me 1 second. Okay. As Deputy Director of the GoLab, Jo led on development of many of our technical guides for commissioners, and undoubtedly many of you would have seen the GoLab how-to guide on procurement. And just to make you all aware, we have recently revised the procurement guide, so an updated version is now available on the GoLab website. So please have a look, let us know your feedback, let us know if it's helpful and how we can make it even better. Julian Blake is a partner at BWB, and his areas of legal expertise include commercial and charity law, private, public and third sector contracts and funding arrangement, public procurement and state aid, and that's just to name only a few of his areas of expertise. He's especially interested in a new innovation partnership procedure, and he's the co-author of the Art of the Possible in Public Procurement, which is an extremely helpful document for those seeking to get a better understanding of how they might apply the innovative and more flexible approaches introduced by the public contract regulations in 2015. So Julian, Jo, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I think now that I've introduced our speakers, we'd also like to get a sense of who we have joining us as participants. So we've got a quick poll for you that you should be able to see on your screens just about now. So if you just take, a couple of minutes, if that, to fill in the survey. I'm hoping everyone can see it on the screen. Okay, great. So I'm see we're getting some responses already.
Well, we fill it in.
Obviously, apologies for those of you who have dialed in and are not able to take the poll. Okay, quite a few participants from local governments, the majority at the moment. Okay, we have a fair number of voluntary sector representatives as well. Unsurprisingly, a lot of representatives from procurement and commissioning teams. Okay, so definitely on the right webinar. And a nice geographical spread as well. Okay. Okay, lots of people currently developing SIBs, so, again, understanding why they'd be interested in procurement. So most of you have already voted, so I'll just wait a few more seconds.
Edward.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, I just want to say thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you, everyone. It's just great to see such a great mix of representatives, and I really appreciate you taking the time this morning. I know you're all very, very busy. And just for you to get a sense of the results we've had. Okay, great. So, as you'll all be aware, we've asked you all to submit your key questions, burning questions around procurement in advance of today's webinar. So we have very much structured the session so as to respond to as many of your questions as possible. As such, bear in mind there might be a little bit of repetition around some of the points that Julian and Joe will make, but hopefully that will just help reinforce some of the key points and the learning from today's session. We have received a significant number of questions, and I should note here, in the interest of time and to make it as relevant and as helpful as possible for everyone, the focus will be on providing more general practical advice to enable you to make your own decisions depending on the specific circumstances of your project. And before we move into the proper session and proper content, just a couple more sort of caveats from me. One is just to say that, as I was saying earlier, that the Go Lab, the focus is very much on engaging with commissioners, and as such today's session will also focus predominantly on the commissioner's perspective, although we obviously do have a number of service providers with us this morning, and we will of course address the questions we've received from them as well. And before I go on to Julian for the first question of today's session, I just want to add that anything we say today is to the best of our knowledge, and it does not constitute legal advice from the university or from the government. So without further ado, Julian, I will come to you for the first question. How does procurement fit within the broader process of developing a social impact bond?
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Well, firstly, you could say lots about public procurement. What I would say to start with is that it's a purposive, facilitative, and permissive regime. It isn't something that should be regarded as presenting barriers and obstacles. Obviously, that's how we experience it quite a lot. And in particular, in relation to social impact bonds, we can recognise that the public procurement rules are substantially influenced by the Social Business Initiative, and that's intended to be the European Commission's Social Business Initiative. That's intended to be facilitated in the way it's described. How procurement and SIBs fit together is a much more significant and complicated process, issue, really, because a SIB is not a service contract. A SIB is a project partnership between three partners at least, between the commissioner, the supplier, and the social investor. It's not something that comes into place in a moment in time like a contract does. It's something that is developed over time. So it's more like a process than a contract, a single service contract. If you think of what it would involve ideas developing, being explored, consultation with the user need, with the supplier capacity, with the social investor interest, with the commissioner commitment. It will involve consultation, feasibility work, pilot design and delivery, actual design and project delivery. So all of that takes place over an extended period of time, and that's really the way to think of social impact bonds. Within it, there will or may be procurement moments. So there might be one in relation to consultancy, there might be one in relation to the pilot element, there might be one in relation to the design of the project, there might be one in relation to the delivery of the project. But really what's required is for the whole concept of the project to be conceived of at the outset as a project, as a developing partnership, with the way in which procurement might come into the process, anticipated at the outset and planned at the outset as far as that can be anticipated.
Great, thank you. So, Joe, could you sort of like say a few words around, why is procurement for social impact bonds more challenging, and sort of just building on what Julian was just saying, sort of, what is the whole process and how does procurement fit in at the different stages?
So I suppose just to echo really a little of what Julian said, which I entirely agree with. I think the particular challenge in the SIB is that procurement rules are really designed where there is a good quality of competition, and the main challenge with SIBs is frequently there isn't the opportunity for open competition in the normal way. However, there is still a very a large pressure on public sector bodies, whoever they may be, to achieve value and to be accountable for achieving that value. So there is a tension to be managed in the way the procurement process is used to demonstrate that value has been achieved, and to indeed to make sure that there's a pressure on the actors in the SIB to offer that value, but without necessarily having an open competition and lots of people putting offers in. So that's what we want to try and navigate a bit today, is how can you be legal and use the process, in the sense of complying with it and acting in the spirit of it as well, which is equally important, whilst responding to those very particular conditions.
That's great. And I thought, just to chip in, just to reassure everyone that throughout this session we will provide more practical examples as well of sort of how other organisations have applied some of the approaches and the options we'll be talking about. So if I just go back to the whole process of developing a social impact bond, so do you want to say a few words and sort of how the procurement considerations come into play at the different stages?
Yeah. So I think this diagram, there's 2 pages to this diagram, and it's really trying to make the point that we've just made, that there are the caveat, there's no single way of developing a SIB, and I've attempted to suggest that there is one, but this is a high level route map, if you can take it in the spirit of that. And really it makes the point that Julian made, that this is a project and a programme of which there are moments in which you engage with the market. And really the point is that it's throughout. So from the very first stage, where really as Commissioner you're trying to define the impact of the problem and understand really what the cost of that problem is to you, and some people will be familiar with that very technical term, develop a counterfactual, i.e. know when you're comparing the value of the solution that you develop, you know whether it's better value and better impact than the problem the existing problem you have. At that stage, if you've already got a partner that's providing that service, you will need to engage with them at this very early stage, if only to get the data that allows you to understand what the impact of the existing problem is, as well as all the community groups and the users that you will engage with as well at that point. So very early stages, possible collaboration. You'll then go on to look at what's the right commissioning model, and many of you will have read what the Audit Commission has said around PBR. You only use it where it's the right fit. So there is a point in time where, as a commissioner, you will decide whether SIBs, or indeed payment by results, the board said is right to achieve value in this sense. And that's about understanding who's out there in the market and how they're likely to respond to you. It has to have that form of contract. So there's understanding the market as you go through that very early stage of deciding whether the SIB is the right vehicle for you. There's then around when you come on to, depending on, you might be using an existing service that's already provided elsewhere. You might be designing something very experimental from the start, but there'll be a point in time which you do a piece of design work, and that's part of the journey on the SIB, whether that's just contextualising things that other people have done, or designing a new model of service or a theory of change. And at that point, there will be a need, very likely, to engage with the market to collect data either around what other providers have actually done, or to work with potential providers around theorising around a new model of service, and that might be your local providers that are already providing a form of this service, or indeed new providers that have an appetite or a different sort of skill set that respond to that design.
Thanks, so that's really helpful. But I think that sort of explains things very much from the Commissioner's perspective. And then we know that there are other routes into developing a social impact one. So we have provider-led initiatives, or perhaps sometimes investor/intermediary-led approaches. So I'm just wondering whether you could say a few words about that, and then how the procurement and pre-procurement engagement fits into that picture.
Yeah, so these are broad brush routes. So we apologise, we're trying to synthesise into some broad brush routes, some quite complex ways in which things happen out there. But we said that there's sort of 3 broad ways. There's simpler end, a commissioner comes up with an idea, they lead the development of the SIB. I guess the point we've just made on the former slide is that there is a point of pre-procurement engagement before as you develop and co-design a new service before you then decide to go to the market, where if you're commissioner-led, you hopefully have access to a knowledge base by that point, which is a microservice specification, and you know, either because you can we'll come on to either the development of a rate card, or you can specify what you're looking for in terms of a price, and then you can go through a procurement of a contract, depending, and your choice will be based on your assessment of the market at that time, you know, the level at which there is a competitive market out there, or you're into a partnership, and then we'll come on to sort of in the later stages of this session on the different routes in which you might use. If it's provider-led, this is where I guess a lot of the questions that come from you have come around, well, what do we do if the provider actually comes with the deal? And this is really a judgment, and I'm speaking, Julian might want to comment around this, but I'm speaking from a commissioner point of view on this. So from a commissioner point of view, what you're really trying to test is how unique the provider solution really is. So what have they done in terms of prototyping or developing and demonstrating the work that they have got a solution that no one else has had. Now, I think those who've been in worked around public procurement, I'm sure many on this call will have done, is that often the bid process itself is the point at which providers, if they have the right capability, can develop a solution. So I think the judgment for commissioners is whether in providing a bid opportunity or a procurement opportunity, a solution can be developed by others, and that creates a more open competition. Equally, there's a judgment to be made in relation to how big the opportunity is, whether an open market competition is too big, cumbersome and expensive to warrant use of open competition in that context. So we're going to come on to some examples of how commissioners have either worked with providers on a partnership basis, having satisfied themselves that that provider has something genuinely unique, or have looked to develop a market prior to, at an earlier point, which allows them to have access to a broader-based competition. But there is it's really that judgment around whether you believe the provider has something genuinely unique that would lead you to enter into some sort of partnership deal. Now, the third example, which we're going to give you some examples in the contracts that we go through, are where it's not a provider in the simple sense that it's a service provider, but it's an intermediary or investor that comes to you saying, I have done some work and I've now some expertise in a particular form of SIB, and I can bring around that some commissioning expertise in the sense that I am sitting alongside the commissioner, knowing what good looks like when it comes to price and procuring a provider, and I will sit with you and engage that provider in the procurement process. So those are the sort of three broad routes.
Brilliant. Yeah. So Joe, because you've mentioned investors, and obviously investors are one of the involvement of social investors is one of the defining features of a social impact bond. So could you just tell us more about how and when to engage with investors? This is a question that we all get asked very often.
Sure. Coming on to. So I think the first thing to say about investors is that they are probably the most experienced organisations in the SIB world. So because they're the ones that do multiple deals. So the first and I guess a very obvious point is engage them early, because they have a huge body of expertise and they're essential to getting your SIB away. So our general advice is engage them early, but be clear about the relationship that you want and when you want that relationship. So there's just a fact. I think one of the questions that arose is legally, how should we engage investors? The provision of finance doesn't sit within the public procurement regulations in the way that the service provider does. So the obligations on you to have an open competition is not the case if you are procuring a simple investment relationship. But what we know is that investors play quite a significant role in the provision of the SIB. Often they're the project manager, they can be the initiator of the SIB. So there's again a judgment to be made around what sort of process you want to run to engage the investors as a partner. Now,
what are the options then? I know that's again something that we've talked about before, and something that gets asked a lot.
So we're going to go through some different models, I think, of how the structure can be set up on a SIB. So this one, I guess, is the more classic one, where in fact you've gone out and you've procured a provider, and the provider has gone out and procured and come with an investor, which they've either joined up in a partnership in order to bid into your contract, or they've actually procured an investor partner afterwards. And really that is, I guess, a model that would probably represent historically the majority of SIBs out there. Okay, great.
We move on to the next model.
The second one is where investors are taking the lead, and this is really the instance that we've just touched on. Is that there are a number of examples out there now where the investor will come to a commissioner and say, I've got some expertise in this. They will seek a relationship, a contractual relationship, which is done by way of negotiation with the commissioner, and a partnership is formed in some way, shape or form. Our advice, talking to the investors about how those partnerships are constituted, is that it is prudent for the commissioner to seek out that early stage some form of memorandum of understanding, or at least some form of the partnership that allows you to get a good understanding of how the investor, when it comes to it, will offer the finance, offer the terms of the finance downstream. The difficulty in this early stage when you engage with an investor, although it has lots of pluses, is that you are going to work with them to shape the project, and therefore it is not possible at that early stage to say how much the investor is going to offer you in terms of the terms of the finance, but you do want something to go back to. So an MOU will give you the ability to go back and then discuss with the investor a hypothesis at a point of time about what terms might look like, even if those terms will be in principle, i.e. they won't be guaranteed. It is then a good relationship with investor will work that you will jointly then create a framework by which you will then procure the provider within an overall kind of envelope of value, in a sense.
Yeah, and there's of course a third option as well, which I guess is similar to the one that has an investor that's part of it.
Yeah, there are entities, just very briefly, act in a similar way to an investor, but they are intermediaries, and they are project-based organisations that will bring investors, providers, and commissioners together, and they are an alternative to forming a relationship with an investor, but similarly would form a relationship with them.
No, that's great. Do you want to add anything?
To illustrate the point I was making at the beginning, that actually the subject of SIBs and public procurement is very different when you're looking at the different routes by which such a project might arise. So you might say, if it's commissioner-led, and very ably commissioner-led, it might look like a procurement because they want to procure the supplier and investor package. On the other hand, the cases I mainly deal with are supplier-led, almost completely supplier-led. That is where the innovation comes from. And it's a very artificial thing for that supplier, after the commissioner has become interested and the investor is on board, it's a very artificial thing to then say, right, we'll procure somebody whose idea this is.
So you've mentioned that you work primarily with provider-led initiatives. And so what do you see as the main challenges then in terms of getting a project off the ground when it's provider-led? And more importantly, how might these challenges be overcome? I mean, we know there are ways to overcome these challenges because we've seen so many SIBs, already.
Without any doubt at all, the artificiality of how procurement relates to supplier-led projects, as I've just described, because it's about procuring a service contract, not about procuring innovation that has been offered to you, which is how that supplier initiative arises. Without any doubt at all, that's the problem. That, we've mentioned the Art of the Possible, this is the booklet that we produced, had quite a lot of influence, but that came out of frustration from supplier-led projects that went a long way in terms of engagement with an interested commissioner, and with investment available, but then somebody said, oh, what about procurement?
So,
rather late in the day, and,
yeah.
and it all needs to be anticipated much earlier as a project concept.
So what are the other blockers other than sort of like thinking about this really early on? Is there a reluctance or lack of awareness within commissioning authorities around the more flexible options available for them?
It's genuinely difficult because there genuinely isn't a clear process for saying, how do we put a project partnership together involving these three parties? We have to adapt the public law generally and the procurement law specifically to that purpose. When we're looking at it from a supplier perspective, we actually come to three routes that seem to suit this type of project better than others, better than the more orthodox procurement routes, in fact. The first is, as Joe has mentioned, recognising that what we actually have is co-investment, that we have partners who are co-investing for a common purpose. We don't have one of the partners commissioning a service contract from another. And if you've got that, you, in principle, don't have procurement. You've still got to look out for procurement moments, as I said at the beginning, but that could be a different way of thinking of it. It's a co-investment, co-design partnership, not a procurement of a service contract. Second, still very common and important, it is, again, as Joe was describing, recognising unique supply when it is really a matter of unique supply. That reality is important, because if you're trying to find a market and there isn't one, then you're engaged in an artificial process. So how you engage with a unique supplier and do engage when they are offering what is required is another route. And there are routes for recognising unique suppliers in the procurement rules. And thirdly, the innovation partnership, which was a product of the Social Business Initiative undertaken by the European Commission in reforming the procurement rules. The latest rules have the innovation partnership procedure, and actually what that does is provide a procedure for that co-investment concept.
And we'll come on to that in a second, but before we move on, so we know that with social impact bonds, you're increasingly looking at achieving scale in the impact that you seek to secure. So could you reflect on sort of, you know, the ability of delivery agencies or service providers to use the SIB approach to win work across multiple authorities, so engage with multiple commissioners?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some models for this. I think one of them, I think we're going to come on to a case study, but the Mental Health and Employment Partnership would be a good example of this, where social finance set up a co-commissioning entity, I think you would call it, but they are expert in individual placement support, which is tackling employment and mental health. And it's a vehicle that's deliberately set up to work with multiple commissioners, and it takes out the hard slog, really, of defining an outcomes framework, defining a specification, and it's deliberately set up so it can be ported to different commissioners, and then it's not so specific that it can't be contextualized for each individual authority and made theirs. And I think that's part of the, you know, what we're seeing is there's another one, SIB, which is still in very much the development stage, the Family Drug and Alcohol Court model. That is, again, set up as a co-commission model, which is going to be taken to multiple commissioners and then applied with them. So I think that's one model where we're seeing the sort of replication of particular models. But I think as colleagues in local government will no doubt feel, what people don't want is a sort of pick up and drop solution that's happened somewhere else just without it being adapted. So I think that's why these models of co-commissioning that are emerging, where there's lots of there's lots of ability to change and localize things that are appropriate.
So while we're on the subject of service providers, I know, you know, securing value for money will be at the part of the concerns of commissioners. And so how can a commissioning authority best deliver value for money given the limited competition that we're seeing sometimes in the, you know, SIB market?
So I think going back to the diagram we took at the start and the journey you're on. So the first thing is if a commissioner really knows what a problem is costing them, they are well on the way to understanding what value looks like when they actually get they work with a provider to get a cost for a service. And you know, the point we keep emphasising is this process is rarely a sort of put a specification out there and get an offer back, although there are instances of services, a few instances like that. It's a much more of a negotiation and a partnership. So what you will be doing is working out whether what you're getting in that discussion and that partnership working from a provider is better than the value it's costing you now. And I think that is part of the message we're trying to get across is it's constituting a working relationship and creating the sufficient tensions in that working relationship. If that is not the outcome, you can actually remove yourself from that relationship perhaps and then get a different partner in. So you don't want to get too far down if you don't think that partner is going to work with you effectively. So it's all part of that initial forming the partnership, making sure that there is a shared aim and a shared imperative to create value is there before as you get into that relationship. Because I think some of the examples we're going to come on to is once you've entered into that and you've invested an awful lot in working out the solution, it's quite difficult to go backwards.
I'll just add something. I think also a very important answer to how do you make sure you're getting value for money out of the process. Partly we're talking about innovation and experimentation, of course, but I would say one of the major answers there is the quality of the analysis, the quality that underpins the theory by which the outcomes will be delivered and the SIB model will therefore work. So that analysis is the key, and going back to the procurement rules tell you to apply that analysis because nobody now should be procuring by reference to price alone. That's been abolished. You should be procuring by most economically advantageous tender in every case, and most economically advantageous tender means the optimal balance between quality, price, and social value. So the critical thing here is the meaningful nature of social value that can be applied in a contract like this. One example, Group SOS in France 30 years ago, what could have been a SIB, they were looking for how you would be able to benefit homeless people and save money at the same time, so increase quality of provision and save money. They hit upon providing flu treatments because that saves pneumonia costs and hospitalisation costs. There was a theory of change that they proved by experimentation, and that was the basis upon which the value was delivered. Huge savings through a very simple innovation.
Okay, one more question for me before we move on, just conscious of time. So obviously procurement regulations are very much predicated on the assumption of competition in the market, which sometimes can be a challenge in terms of social impact bonds. So how can a local commissioner best create a level playing field of providers, in particular getting the balance right between the smaller organizations and then larger providers who already have experience of social impact bonds?
I think as we touched on in that kind of journey map, I think it's really, we hear this a lot, and I think there is it's about capacity building in your local market. SIBs are often a vehicle to change in the way you want to engage with your market, so your local market. So some sort of prior engagement to say that we're moving down towards an outcome route. This is what it means. It takes the providers themselves on a journey before you actually ask them to respond to that journey in terms of the outcome framework, which is very important. Equally, if you want to change your market, then it also becomes a way in which you create a competition which perhaps suits organisations that you want to welcome into your supply chain, as opposed to organisations that perhaps you feel aren't responding or in that accountable way.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I think that goes back to Julian's point about, procurement for SIBs. It's not just about the actual procurement exercise. It's a much broader process that you need to start thinking about really early on.
One other fact to bear in mind, which is that the European Commission was very clear in the Social Business Initiative that led into the current procurement rules, that broadly speaking, people understand the need for objectivity in public service commissioning, and that it is totally legitimate, they said very explicitly, also to use public procurement procedures to pursue common societal objectives. So there's that factor that can play into the process as well.
Okay, so Julian, I'll come to you now. You've mentioned procurement procedures, and one of the most popular questions we've received from our participants this morning is around the different procurement routes available for those developing social impact bonds. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of confusion. There's, different options, approaches available. So could you just start by saying, what the rule book says, and then what are some of the lesser known procedures that are available to those developing SIBs?
Okay, so it was mentioned at the beginning we might be repeating ourselves a little bit.
A little bit.
And I'm going to repeat myself. I would say that you don't start with public procurement rules when you're looking at a SIB. We also need to remember, as we've also said, that when you're looking at a SIB, you might be looking at one that the commissioner has led and developed. You might be looking at one where the investor has led and developed. and you might be looking at one where the supplier has led and developed, and they might come together in different combinations in different ways. So the procurement questions will arise in different ways in relation to any of those processes. I would say, repeating myself again, but a very simple answer is if the commissioner is totally in the lead, it's quite likely that that will be quite an orthodox procurement process. But turn it around, and this is where it is most difficult. It's when the supplier is in the lead where it's most difficult, because that's not the commissioner going to the market. That's the supplier coming up with a proposition and taking it to the commissioner. And what has happened in a number of cases is that people are confused about how they should deal with procurement in that situation, because it isn't obvious, and there isn't an obvious and there isn't a clear route. So my answer in that case is again to go back to the different processes. When the supplier comes with a proposition, you may hit some procurement moments, but the first question is this co-investment? So supplier comes with the idea, most literally, we will put 50% of the capital into this project. Public authority, you have a common interest in this. Will you put 50% of the capital into this project? That would be absolutely clearly the starting of a co-investment project and not a procurement. Second point, quite often, the reality is this is a very innovative proposition. And if the commissioner gets very interested in it, and the investor gets very interested in it, because of, take that group SOS example again, if that comes to a municipality, they like the idea of it, they can see that the pilot works, they really want to engage. Now that conversation starts and it develops, and somebody at some point says, well, what about procurement? And if you're able to say, well, the reality is that is the only method by which this project's going to get off the ground. That's the supplier who has the innovation. In commercial terms, that's the supplier that's got the intellectual property that will allow this to happen. So identifying it as a unique proposition and following the procurement routes that allow that. Voluntary ex-ante transparency notice, the PIN process if you're going to follow a more orthodox procurement process. I mean, the negotiated procedure is there to facilitate recognising a unique supplier, and I hope we'll be talking about innovation partnerships.
Absolutely. So I guess if I'm understanding correctly what you're saying, it is about having that, clarity about your circumstances and the, in your intention and the stakeholders within your market. Have that very clear early on, and then use that as the basis to decide what might be the most appropriate route for you.
Without any doubt at all, and I'd say something quite simple. Often procurement is raised too early because we don't know what all those factors are yet, and also often it's raised too late because we've been discussing things for far too long and haven't really worked out how we're supposed to deal with it yet.
So Joe, I'll come to you for this. So then any sort of concrete practical tips for commissioners sort of operating in this, fairly uncertain landscape to some extent? I mean, sometimes I suppose it's difficult to have a, clear position as to if the proposition of a service provider, for example, is truly unique. For example, I mean, there might be other questions as well. So I think, what Julian was saying was very helpful, but I think sometimes for the commissioner, it might not be as, clear cut. Particularly with SIBs, I suppose it's all about sort of early collaboration and dialogue, and sometimes you might not be 100% sure as to, what all your options are.
Yep. I mean, I think we've touched on it really. It's about, for a commissioner, it's about not so much the rules, I think, as how you're going to get the best value. And I think as we go around and talk to commissioners, the environment in which people are operating is, value is king, and you really have to know that you're going to achieve what you want to financially. So the judgment around procurement is, as Julian said, a really helpful comment. Don't do it too early. Don't do it too late. It's absolutely right. But just for example, so waste to wellness, which is one of the better known SIBs, just by way of an example. So that's a good example of a SIB that emerged through a strong partnership ethos. It emerged as a pilot through grant funding, and an entity formed around that called the Waste to Wellness team that had completely unique knowledge because of the way that they developed the social prescribing service in the context of Newcastle. Quite late on, it was then thought that a SIB was a good route, and quite late on it was then thought, well, how are we going to procure this? By which time because of the time it happened, Monitor were the entity responsible for contracting in the NHS, and they took a lot of persuading, and that took a lot of time to get them comfortable around what was effectively a non-competitive process to procure the special purpose company that Waste to Wellness then came. They used then more classic procurement routes to procure the 4 providers that actually deliver the services under the auspices of the Waste to Wellness SPC. But what was very difficult in their eyes was that there was no competitive process that they could actually provide. So now, the comment that has been made by the Waste to Wellness team to me is, in retrospect, they should have given the CCG the opportunity to think about the procurement process they would like to run earlier, but they were presented with someone fait accompli in good faith. There was no bad faith suggested in this. It's the way that the project emerged. So I think the lesson in that is, look, there's no doubt that the Waste to Wellness has delivered value and is a very effective body, but it created, the fact that the procurement process wasn't considered created undue delay and discomfort on the side of the commissioners that could have been avoided had the procurement route been thought of earlier.
So, Joe, you've mentioned that Waste to Wellness developed a truly unique proposition. So can I go to Julian now and ask you, you're very interested obviously in the innovation partnership. Could this have been an example of using the innovation partnership?
Yes, indeed. And there's still the issue about timing, but I would say with that sort of project that's developing in an innovative way and each of the 3 parties are providing their input, the conversations will start and the conversations will continue, and they can't continue too long before you at least address, how the public law works. And ideally it's addressed, from the outset. Going back to the way you can manage these processes, it's totally understood that judging something to be a co-investment and not a procurement is something that is perceived to involve risk. Judging something to be unique when it might not be, and you might not be able to market test fully, it is perceived to involve risk. I think both of them can be done more than they are, but both of them have they're not perfect answers without continuing concerns, let's say. But that leads us to the Innovation Partnership, because the Innovation Partnership, which is a new procedure introduced into the latest procurement rules, in a way answers the co-investment point, because it gives you a procedure for dealing with co-investment. And it can deal with the innovation point as well through the way in which you engage with somebody that is able to deliver design and delivery.
We know that innovation partnerships haven't been used in the UK to date.
No.
So going to Joe now, then would you be able to say a few words then perhaps about the sort of procedures, processes that have been used in the United Kingdom to develop social impact bonds?
Yes, so I think we're touching on them. So there's the PIN, prior information notices, the BEATs, tend to be the ones that are used in a more restrictive competitive process, and successfully in some cases. We've probably touched on the rationale for that. That is, they're both cases where you do not believe that open competition is the right approach, either because there's very clearly a particular provider that's that is clearly able to provide that service. And also there's also a principle of proportionality, that you don't want to run a very expensive and open competition where actually there isn't much competition out there. So it's one of you, again, coming back to your judgment around what is the likely response. And if you are unlikely to get any viable competition, then these 2 procedures are really for using either prior information notice allows someone to say within a restricted amount of time, yes, I would like to participate in this competition, and the VEAT is a retrospective notice that says I've already decided, using my good judgment, which you need to be able to justify, that it was right to engage this provider without competition, and it's giving notice which can be objected to. So they are both valid.
So could you give us an example perhaps of one social impact bond that was developed using one of these procedures?
Well, I'm going to ask Julian to do this one, because Julian actually was involved in putting travel training together, so I was going to give him the honour of...
and securing the VEAT notice as well. travel training is an innovative project that was developed by HCT Group, a very innovative social enterprise working in the transport sector. Turns over about 60 million, so it's commercially competitive. And HCT Group were thinking about how you could improve the statutory transport services. So when public authorities have to provide transport for disadvantaged people, elderly people, but in this case disadvantaged people, who need assistance with their travel. And what they proposed was that you don't just provide that service, which in some extreme cases are provided by most inappropriate transport services. You provide the service, and integrated with the service is a training program, so that somebody who needs assistance to travel is trained to become an independent traveller. That was the concept, and it was a very valuable thing, because as with that Group SOS example I gave earlier, it hits three positive requirements. It improves the service for the individual, it improves the quality of the service, and it saves money, because that individual will become an independent traveller and won't need the service any longer. So HCT Group, because they're a social enterprise, have the capacity both to deliver transport and to deliver the required sort of social care that allows for this training to be provided. Their view was that there's nobody else in the market, in the transport market, the statutory services, who deliver that, or had even conceived of delivering that. They developed the proposition, they took it to public authorities. Public authorities were very interested indeed. And then we have the story of the public procurement being raised as a problem, because they were interested, but then how do they procure something that HCT is offering to them? And in fact, that very fact gave rise to this booklet. Three cases, three different local authorities dealt with it in three ways. One of them said it was illegal, and that was the end of the conversation. Another one went through a very laborious process, well, actually a normal process, but not following the principle of proportionality that Joe mentioned, which is one of the fundamental treaty principles, because they went through a process to award the contract to HCT Group when there was no other competition. In fact, the notes are a little bit misleading on that. There wasn't another challenge. It's just that they felt they had to go through a process to appoint the unique provider. And the third one worked. The third one, we said to the Commissioner, don't you think this is a unique process? And the Commissioner said, yes, I do. But my lawyer and my procurement officer are telling me I've got to do something different. And so we said, well, why don't we talk to the lawyer and the procurement officer and say, this is a unique process. So this is, if it is unique, you can market test whether it's unique. As Joe said, by the voluntary ex ante notice, we believe we are engaging with a unique proposition. You put out a notice saying, is there anyone else out there who thinks that's not right? And if nobody else replies, because there is nobody else out there who can offer the same thing, then the notice period expires and you can proceed, and that's exactly what happened. So that project is working very successfully out of the application of the lead process.
Yeah, so Joe, when might it be appropriate then for a commissioner to go down the route of an open competitive process?
Well, I guess this is territory everybody will understand the most. That this is where you've got a good market, that people recognise the specification, and you're confident that the market will give you a good value in the way it responds. So it's less of a partnership and more of a slightly more arm's length competition. If I just flip over, I just want to give you an example actually of where open competition has been used in SIBs, and question mark whether it's the right thing to do. So reconnections, again, it's very innovative SIB. It's dealing with loneliness, and all hats off to them having a go at sibbing loneliness, but they have, and they've done it, it's working. But the journey here is that the idea came out of some work by Social Finance and Age UK, working together as a partnership, creating the initial business case that came up with a very interesting piece of cost-benefit analysis that showed the Commissioner that investing in loneliness actually would produce value. Huge, extensive collaboration as part of that. The Commissioner then chose to run an open procurement process that took 10 months, basically, to run end-to-end. And the only entity they could actually award to was Age UK, who originally developed the concept. Now, question mark, and Julian might want to comment on this, there is a question mark being reflected in the evaluation, is whether that was actually a good way to procure it in this instance, because it had been developed there's nobody else that delivers loneliness, certainly in a SIB environment in this way, no one else who has gone through the journey of understanding the cost benefit and coming up with a service model. So there's a question of bravery, I think, which we're hinting at, is that there are a judgment to be made as whether competition is going to genuinely serve your purpose, or whether it's just giving you air cover for judgments down the line about whether you actually tested yourself for value. But if you know if you've done your business case well, and this is part of the journey to SIBs, is that with the development grants that you get, you do develop a business case that you know, you have some sense of how value is going to be delivered. And the competition only is a part player in enabling you to get that value. So it's again a judgment around whether the act of competition, the act of using competition in the procurement context is the right vehicle.
Great. Can I just pause for a second? I'm just conscious we've got about 60 people join us online today. Could I just remind you all that you can ask questions using the chat box on the right-hand side of your screens? Please do, any questions or any point of clarification you have, we will try to address those as well. All right, should we move on then? There is a third option as well, Jo.
Yeah. So
do you wanna?
The third option is the option that tends to get used in national procurements, like for example the DWP Innovation Fund, where the commissioner knows essentially they can set a payment rate because they know that what the current cost of the problem is, and if they then apply that rate, they know they're securing value. And really what they're saying is how much quality, or in some cases how much volume can you give me for this rate that I want to pay you. Now it's appropriate, it's also where you potentially get to use where a service has been out to market before and has been SIB'd before, and because you can see what other commissioners, what rates other commissioners have got, what the value points might be. So an example of that is some of the edge of care SIBs sitting around where there is data now available for how multi-systemic therapy, for example, what the value commissioners have got from the same service model for different commissioners, and it's possible that a commissioner could set a schedule of a payment rate as opposed to look for the market to make an offer.
What are some of the risks that are associated with it? I mean, I know, within the Go Lab we talk about things like gaming, for example. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Well, gaming is where there's ways of getting payments so disingenuously it's classically in the welfare to work arena. Gaming refers to the act of passing on premium, i.e. you select against the cohort that's your target cohort and take those are easier bluntly to actually get the payment rates. But I think in the design of the service model for SIBs, there's a lot of work goes into defining who the cohort are, defining the referral route by which those individuals are then come into the service, and making sure that the act of select the service providers cannot unduly select those that might be easier to help, or cherry pick classically is the language that gets used.
Okay, so the key here would be that a commissioner needs to be confident they can define the value of the payments that they attach to the improved outcomes. Okay, great. Julian, I think you clearly already touched upon a potential fourth option around the sort of partnering up of the commissioner and the investor. And Jo, you've already mentioned the MHEP partnership. Are there any particular lessons or top tips for commissioners if they are looking to partner with an investor or perhaps intermediary?
I think, at risk of repeating, I think the dance, there's a lot of advantage in going this route, partnering up with an entity that is very clear about and comfortable with investing in your service, and also have the real knowledge and expertise around how to specify and how to manage the best performance out of the service provider. That's a clear, very good value proposition. The thing to be aware of as a commissioner is if you enter into those partnerships, at some point downstream, that partner will then decide what the terms of the finance are, and you will not be in a point, you will not have a means of competing that at that point, unless you simply sack them and say, I'm not happy with the terms of your finance, off you go, we'll now go out to an open competition, which of course you can, but you've been through a very long journey with them. They're embedded into your commissioning activity by that point, and that makes it very tough. So there's some thought right at the start about how you constitute that relationship, so you've got some place to go back to and some understanding of how you're going to get to that understanding of the terms of the finance they're going to offer.
I'd also add something philosophical and political about this process, which is that the premise, if we're talking about procurement, is, as Joe said several times, competition. But what the partnership concept suggests is you have a commissioner who's interested in the societal objectives, a supplier who's interested in the societal objectives. Certainly the commercial scale public and social enterprises are able to provide that, like HCT Group, as we've mentioned. And the social investor, as a social investor, is interested in the objective too. That's collaboration, which is a different concept to competition and can also work. It's purpose-driven, not profit-driven, and it's social value-driven, not shareholder value-driven. Now, that's a shift in the way the concept of public service markets, if they are markets, they're not really markets, in a lot of ways work. And so it's perfectly legitimate to recognise, if we're talking about project partnerships, we're talking about partnerships and collaboration, and that you need to work out how that collaboration interrelates with competition, because it isn't the case that competition is or ought to be the totally dominant element.
Thank you. We've had a couple of comments from our audience who are telling us that they can't hear us very well. Apologies for that. We weren't aware of that. Could I just remind everyone who has dialed in just to mute their lines, please? You know, and again, apologies if some of us can't hear us very well. We will share the slides. We will share our notes as well in the whole recording of the session. So if you've missed any points, hopefully you'll be able to get those from the slides. So Joe, sorry, just to go back to the point you made about gaming, someone mentioned that the reception was particularly bad right when you were talking about that. Would you mind just sort of summarizing your explanation around, you know, gaming and some of the key issues just before we move on? Would that be okay? Okay,
so gaming, for the example I gave was welfare to work. So classically, that was where the main work programme and was where the issues were raised. So, for example, the concerns were raised that providers were able to select or park or cream their service users within the cohort. So they're basically dealing with the easier to help when the payment structure assumed a much different mix of cohort. So they were able to make a bigger profit if they could cherry pick within that overall cohort. So SIBs have given a lot of thought to how you can mitigate against that form of gaming, so that you have to deal with the whole cohort, and that the referral routes into the service make sure that the service provider is not able to select or cherry pick those service users inappropriately.
Okay, thank you. Julian, we did say that we will repeat some points throughout today's session. So someone just asked a question about innovation partnerships. So could you say even more about how they are and what they work, and then when they might be used?
Yes, thank you. So to add something I haven't said yet, which is one of the most attractive things about the innovation partnership procedure, it's the only procedure where a project partnership is given its full potential, because it's the only procedure which allows you to commission the design of a project and the first contract delivery of the project in the same contract. In every other procedure, all the ones we've talked about, you would need to ask the question, once you've got the design, and is the designer the best to deliver? Because they might not be. There might be a different market for delivering something that's been designed. Now that is going to be problematic for the supplier. The supplier, talking commercially, doesn't want to put all their effort and know-how and intellectual property into a service design, which is then going to go into a specification, which everybody else is going to deliver against. And that's not in the interest of the commissioner, because the commissioner doesn't want the cooling of the innovation that's coming from potential designers. So the innovation partnership answers that point absolutely directly in a way that none of the other procedures does. It says, for example, in relation to SIBs, but in relation to any other partnership type development project, you can commission the design of a new service and the first contract delivery of that service as well as a single package. So that's really a very significant factor. I've already mentioned one thing, so to repeat, it's also the procedure that helps you with co-investment because it gives you a procedure where there wasn't one before. And so you don't need to worry about the risks of proceeding without a procurement at all. You can follow the innovation partnership procedure. The big problem with innovation partnership is nobody's doing them because nobody's doing them. We're moving forward. People are now interested in them. The most striking thing about innovation partnerships for me was the contrast between going to a conference of procurement lawyers who all declared that the atmosphere, the consensus of the meeting was that the innovation partnership added nothing, so they missed the design and delivery in one contract point. I then went to Brussels and heard Professor Christopher Bovis talking about innovation partnerships, and he was effusive in his praise for the European Commission for putting it into the new rules, for recognising how that would answer significant questions when you're trying to procure a project, procure a partnership, as opposed to trying to procure a service contract.
Yeah, right. We've had a new question from our audience. So value for money, obviously, you know, fundamental thing to keep in mind. So how do we avoid the criticisms of investors that they potentially make excessive profits? Can I come to you, Joe, for that one? I mean, you know, it's open to, you know, well, both of you, I guess.
I think it's probably going over the ground we talked about. It's making sure that you've got some sort of competitive tension when, as far as or some point of meaningful negotiation with your investor partner to make sure that you can understand the terms to be offered. I think what we're starting, the investors will say, look, if what you get is better value against the price that the cost of that problem to you now, or achieving your aims for making savings, you don't need to worry about what the cost of finance is, because effectively, you know, we are achieving your objectives, and that's that will be something that you would probably get told if you engage with some of the investors, and it's true to an extent. I think what we are, what investors will do when they offer you terms is they're basing those terms on what they think is going to happen. And one of the things that we know in SIBs is you're really starting, when you sign a contract, really what you're signing off is a hypothesis that something is going to work in that way. And investors take quite a significant risk on whether the outcomes are going to be achieved. So the honest answer is that there is investors don't know how much return they're going to make until they're in the delivery of the contract and at the end of it. And we are at quite an early stage in understanding how SIBs actually perform. So there isn't a lot of custom practice or knowledge about the actual returns that investors are making yet. Although I think it's a concern we all share. This doesn't want to be, you know, another PFI in a sense that all of a sudden we find out after the fact that investors have actually made huge amounts of money. But they are social investors, and they are genuinely triple bottom line investors that want to create impact as much as anything else. So you know, we should take some reassurance from their own mission and values.
I'll just make a comment. I think what we haven't said very, very directly yet is it's a detailed and complex process putting one of these projects together, one of these partnerships together. And in particular, it's a detailed and complex process working out the theory of how the outcomes are delivered and how they're financed. So the quality of the concept, the quality of the design, the quality of the project specification requires real application. So that's one answer. You really apply yourself to making sure that the figures seem to work. Another point is, it was mentioned at the beginning that there might be a little bit of bias one way or the other. I think the question is slightly biased towards the Commissioner, because it kind of assumes that the Commissioner is the only one who's looking at value in terms of the project, and that is absolutely not the case with the commercial scale, mature social enterprises. They're wanting to deliver the purpose. And so collaboration is a way of also recognising that there won't be, to put the Commissioner's perspective, excessive remuneration. So, for example, HCT Group, I've mentioned a couple of times, they make propositions which include making the reasonable margin as a charitable deliverer to make sure that they're sustainable and they can develop. And then they say, if we make profit beyond that on this very innovative project, which we're quite likely to do, we'll profit share with you. And that's another aspect of partnership. And they're absolutely not the only mature social enterprise out there that's offering those things. There's a group called E3M, about 35 chief executives. They also were behind this Art of the Possible. And they are like HCT Group in their way of focusing on purpose, focusing on delivery, and working alongside commissioners in partnership.
Hi, I've got another question from our audience. Thank you very much, by the way, for submitting your questions. So for provider-led SIBs, in order to plan for a co-investment partnership group, must the provider financially contribute? Now, I'm not...
So,
Yeah. If you could unpick that, yeah, I'm not quite sure.
In SIBs, what Julian was referring to is where there are scenarios where the provider will invest in developing an experiment, a proof of concept. And I think that's where the language on co-investment was used earlier. On SIBs, the providers take different levels of risk. There are examples where there are SIBs where there is no drawdown of investor finance. There's provision made, but actually providers cope very well. So it's kind of in extremis facility to draw down, through to investors that do fund all of the cash for providers and basically take all of the financial risk. So unhelpfully, it's on a spectrum, and it depends on the financial facilities for providers and their appetite for risk. Clearly there's a cost to transferring risk over to investors, because if you're relying entirely on that, you're paying probably a higher cost of finance. And the service providers, if they're able to bear some of that risk themselves, might do that in the spirit of, offering better value. So that's all to be explored.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you. So I think we've got time for one more question from the audience. And again, this is something that gets asked quite a lot. So is a private sector company which has a social focus but is profit making a potential vehicle for a social impact bond?
Yeah, this is it's something you speak to, you get different answers on this. There are rules relating to the funding, the source of funding around this, that come from different parties. Some, which is why, if you're going through the big lottery route for your development grant, you may get an answer that suggests that there is not funding for private sector. Now, I may be off the pace in understanding whether that has now gone away, so don't take my word on that, but that was certainly an early position. I think because the rules around Big Society Capital, who are one of the main investors in the funds provided through Big Lottery, Commission Investor Outcomes Fund, and anyway, the other fund,
Life Chances Fund.
Yeah, Life Chances Fund. That my went blank, because they were a major investor. They had rules around the financing of private sector organisations. It was not possible for private sector, privately owned organisations to be part of the SIBs. However, that is because of that route. In principle, the answer is there's no reason, of course, why not. Privately owned organisations could compete in this space. There's no inherent, unless, Julian, you're going to tell me there is.
No, I totally agree, but it's a market shifting thing for me, because if you think of procurement generally, we've got some real egregious examples of private sector failure, and what we want to say is that's because it isn't really a market. It needs to be at least a quasi-market or a managed or a regulated market to deliver the coverage, the quality, the sustainability you really need. So the commissioner generally is making sure that the market, if it is a market, or the suppliers are delivering to a standard. And what I would say is, if they're doing that and they're looking at the social supplier, the good social suppliers, they can see what that standard is. And there's absolutely no reason in principle why they can't demand the same standard from any type of supplier. At the moment, we've got it the other way around, and we all think that we must go for the lowest price and the commercial supplier. But what we should actually do is say we must go for that quality, and the commercial suppliers must deliver that quality.
I think the point is really well made, that there is a level of trust, I think, in creating a SIB, because you only ever hope that something's going to happen. And there's a lot which we haven't covered at all in this yet, there is a more invested in the governance and management of the contract afterwards than there would be normally. You don't try and prescribe all the conditions by which that might, and all the eventualities that might happen in the contract. There is a level of then relational contracting that you're trying to embed. And if you've got mission-based organisations around the table, then you can afford to have that trust. Whereas perhaps profit-seeking organisations might have, they're much maligned for it, of course, but they might have different priorities or be forced in that direction.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, just really quickly, Julian, sort of going back to the innovation partnership. You've already touched upon this, but from the Commissioner's perspective, you know, what do you think are the main reasons why authorities don't seem to be using it?
Because it's new.
Simple as that.
Full stop. Because also myths develop. So there was a period when people were saying you can only use innovation partnerships for IT contracts, can't you? And that was quite pervasive. There's currently, I mean, the LGA has published their guidance, which has the LGA has become interested in innovation partnerships, and they published their guidance. But at the moment, their guidance says they think they like the idea, but there might be a state aid problem. And I don't see why there should be a state aid problem, because you can manage state aid in the same way as you can manage procurement. You've just got to make sure it's objective and you're pursuing the purpose in the right way. So myths develop. People are afraid of doing new things. And I think it's probably as simple as that.
Right, thank you. Moving on to sort of like key tips or advice around developing your procurement plan, I think we've already covered all this point, unless you wanted to add anything else specifically on. Yeah. Otherwise, I'd like to sort of move on to more questions that we've received in advance of the session. So transparency, intellectual property, huge concerns, particularly in provider-led SIBs. So how can councils avoid challenge on fairness and transparency grounds, for example, given that the very undertaking of a feasibility study, and I'm thinking in particular with Life Chances Fund projects, for example, gives the provider advantage knowledge of the commissioning organisation and customer needs and so on. So I suppose like a question that commissioners have been asking, you know, time and again, particularly in relation to Life Chances Fund, if they work with the provider on developing the feasibility/business case, does that put them at risk of challenge on transparency or fair treatment grounds?
I would say that the sort of management of information is probably the most difficult procurement point in relation to this whole process, because we've talked about the development of the project starting with the idea and ending with the delivery, and that being a very long process involving the interaction of different parties. Now, if you, and we've also mentioned that there might be different procurements at different stages, so there might be a consultancy one, there might be a pilot one, there might be a design, there might be delivery. And we've also mentioned that actually what tends to happen is the discussions go on a bit long before someone's really worked out how you're going to deal with procurement. And all of that means it is quite likely, in truth, that the suppliers that are being involved in the discussions at an earlier stage are going to get preferential information which would be relevant at a later stage. So you've got to be really alert to that from the beginning, more than you are in normal procurements. In normal procurements, you're concerned about pre-procurement consultation and people getting preferential information out of that, and you've got to manage that to make sure everybody gets the same information that was available at the consultation stage, at the bidding stage. This is a grand version of that. You've got to make sure that that information is managed so that if and when a procurement moment arises during that whole process, you're alert to the need to provide the same information to all parties, and that it means the information that somebody might have got preferentially at an earlier stage. Actually, often, in reality, we're not talking about a competitive process, but in principle, that's what you should be doing.
Okay, so intellectual property, I'll come to you, Joe, for this. Is there a tension between the need on the, I suppose, provider side to protect their intellectual property, particularly develop, you know, cutting-edge, very innovative approaches, and then the need to work collaboratively with commissioners, investors, and so on?
Yeah, and this is not a new thing. I mean, everybody is involved in competitive dialogues, processes, which have been around for somewhat longer. There is always that tension between engagement, disclosing information or citing views and providing evidence, and then responding then openly to a specification. And in a way, I think commissioners are pretty well versed on how you navigate that. I mean, our simple suggestion is there is, to Julian's point, there are procurement moments, but there are probably agreement moments, put it like that, where if you are intending to engage particular providers, either singly or multiple, that you have some sort of memorandum of understanding that says, look, we're intending to go to a competition, but please, these are the terms on which we want to engage you prior to competition, just so there's an understanding on both sides around how information is going to be used. There's two angles to intellectual property. There's protecting the provider's knowledge and disclosure, but there's also making sure that when you're investing in a SIB, and commissioners should see this as an investment because there are cheaper ways of contracting often than a SIB. Really what you're doing is you're getting intelligence out of the exercise that you will then use in subsequent procurement or commissioning decisions to make better informed commissioning decisions. So really what you want to make sure is that in your contract, your provider is not able to take away the intellectual property without take away the knowledge that then is going to be valued to you as a commissioner. So I think looking at that transparency of intellectual property in the round is important. But in pre-procurement terms, then we suggest an MOU with your provider that gives the non-disclosure assurances around how information is provided and gives them assurance that you'll protect things that are unique to them.
Okay, so yeah, two perspectives. The supplier perspective on this. As I said earlier, the worst thing for a supplier would be to put all their innovative effort into an engagement, which then stops because there needs to be a procurement. The specification is written by reference to all the valuable innovative information they provided, and that goes to market and somebody else wins. Very, very unfair to that supplier. What actually happens quite often is because the socially focused, purpose-driven organisation is involved, they're not as alert to their intellectual property rights as they might be. So if you advise them in commercial terms, you would say, you have to go into that initial discussion very alert to your intellectual property. And the way it should work is you show what an interesting proposition you have to the commissioner. The commissioner is very excited by it. You say, right, now I'm taking away my interesting proposition. You've retained the idea of it, but you don't have the information. You can write your specification based on the idea, not the information that I provided you. Then the specification gets written in a way that still means that intellectual property is valuable, because it will be a very distinctive response to that specification containing that idea.
Great, thank you. So we're getting really close to the end of our session, and before we wrap up, could I just ask you both to perhaps, share with our audience, your number one top tip or piece of advice that you'd give to those developing a SIB project, and I'll start with you, Joe. And I know you've helpfully actually already put together sort of like checklists that people might want to consider as they start thinking about their procurement strategy.
So we'll touch on a couple of them then. So I think the top one is again, risk of repeating ourselves. It's because you go through a business case process with this, you have a baseline generally of which you know where the best value is achieved through the procurement process. So it's unlike some of the other procurements that you would run where in that context. So the business case plays a very important role for you as a commissioner, knowing where value is going to achieve, rather relying on the purity of the competition to give you the best possible value. I think there are different structural implications which we've touched on in the slides around contract structures, but probably we didn't bring out the point that where there's a particular value in an intermediary where you've got multiple providers involved, and there's an advantage for commissioners if they want to be able to change out providers for performance reasons. So where you might have a doubt or about whether your provider is going to perform because you're either doing something very risky or very different, and you want the ability to change out that provider rather than cancel the contract, So that's where actually a role of an intermediary can be very useful as a partner in helping manage that sort of those different sorts of innovative stuff.
Thank you. Key takeaways from you,
Julian? From my perspective, no doubt at all. Start with recognising the SIB as a three-party project partnership, and anticipating that there may or may not be procurement issues arising in relation to it. Get the project plan sorted out as quickly as you can, i.e. when you've got the three participants involved, the commissioner, the supplier and the social investor, and anticipate procurement at that stage. The key elements within the process, consultation with the users by reference to what the needs really are, with the suppliers by reference to what the possibilities are. The project collaboration agreement, so everybody's clear on how the three parties interrelate. We've mentioned two things recently in this session: management of information, which is an important procurement issue, management of intellectual property, which is an important further issue. The biggest issue, I think, probably is application to the specification. It's complex, it's detailed, it may come from any of the three parties in different proportions, but it really is a detailed and applied process. And finally, one last pitch for the innovation partnership. If you've got a contract which is design and delivery in the same contract, everyone is in a better position.
Great, thank you very much. So that takes us to the end of our session. Sort of just to reiterate, so I hope that we've managed to clarify at least some of your questions around procurement for SIBs. I'm sure we haven't, managed to answer all your questions. The good news are there are, further helpful resources available online. So Julian's already mentioned the Out of the Possible in Public Procurement, and that's available on the GoLab website as well on the BWB website. I've mentioned earlier the how-to guide on procurement developed by the GoLab, and very much under Joe's leadership. We've now revised that, so please go on our website, read the guide, and let us know your feedback. Let us know if it's helpful. In terms of next steps as well, I'm conscious that some of you will have further questions, other things I might want to ask. So we'd be really keen to understand, what other types of supports would be helpful to enable you to progress the development of your SIB project. So we've put together a very quick poll, which I'll just ask you to, respond to very quickly just now. You should all see the questions on your screen. With a peer network of learning and support will be helpful, where you can talk to, other commissioners or providers going through, a similar process. Would you like to see more masterclasses on other topics? Perhaps a follow-on webinar on further procurement considerations. And just to say, if you've got, any other feedback about today's session as well, or any further questions or suggestions, please just drop them in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen, or just drop us an email at golab@bsg.ox.ac.uk. We really value your feedback, and in terms of us sort of shaping our offer of support for commissioners, it's really, really important to get your views. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay.
And we agree, more case studies. That's a big focus, I think, of the next iteration.
Yeah, so a lot of requests for more case studies. We've obviously tried to include a couple in today's session. And you'll find some of them in the new procurement guide as well. Okay, we'll leave you maybe another minute to finish voting. If you've sort of chosen, for example, technical guidance and other information resources, perhaps you could drop us a line just to, clarify, more specifically what kind of technical guidance would be particularly helpful. Equally, if you've suggested a masterclass, please let us know what topics would be most relevant. Okay. So I'm now sharing the results with everyone, so you should all see what the other participants on the webinar have responded, just to get you a sense of what people think would be helpful. Okay, before we go, it looks like we might have a couple more questions from the audience. Okay, so we've already shared the poll results. Okay, great. So that literally takes me to the end of our session, I've mentioned at the start, the recording of the session will be made available on the GoLab website, and on the website you'll find the slides from today's session as well. Joe, Julian, thank you very, very much for your time this morning and for all the helpful advice you've been providing, and also for your helpful input to the how-to guide on procurement. And thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Bye.